Hello! Today we're diving into a super important topic in sound design and in music, reverb. In this video we'll break down what reverb is, why it matters, and the different kinds of reverbs in Ableton. The normal reverb, the hybrid reverb, and the convolution reverb. Explaining what makes them different, how to use them, and, well, let's get into it. But first things first, what is reverb? Imagine you clap your hands in a small room, it bounces off the walls and it goes into your ears almost immediately. Now imagine you're standing in a big cathedral, you clap your hands, those sound waves have to travel a lot longer in the big room than in the small room. Reverb is essentially the natural echo or reflections of sounds in spaces. It helps us perceive the room size and the room shape. Without it, you lack the essence of space. And sometimes you want that. In music production, most of the time we simulate this effect with plugins and we control how much we want the effect and we can shape the room. But it's also very easy to overdo and make things muddy, so try not to overuse it. Use a bit of finesse. I'm gonna show you how. Alright, let's start with your basic bread and butter reverb. The classic Ableton reverb. It's perfect for quickly adding some reverb to your sounds without doing a lot of things. It's simple but effective. Let's go over the main controls. Size. This knob controls the size of the virtual room you're creating. A smaller reverb gives you a tighter and a quicker sound, like you're standing in a small room. A larger size gives you a big washy effect, like you're standing in a stadium or in a cavern. There's also the smooth knob attached to the size knob. But this only matters if you're changing the size parameter while the music is playing. None makes it more granular, fast and slow makes it change over a period of time. Decay time. This determines how long you want the effect to be. Short decay times fade quickly, while long decay times let the tails of the reverb stretch out. It's also here you can do some impossible things, like creating an impossible room with a very long decay but an ultra small size. You'll find that it almost makes this metallic note from the sound you put it into. Pre-delay. This is the amount of time there is between the original sound and when the reverb kicks in. A little pre-delay can maintain your clarity in your mix. Like if you're putting on drums, you can maintain the punchiness of the drums before the reverb kicks in. Density. This controls the thickness of the reverb. Low density sounds sparser and more like individual echoes, while high density fills up space, creating a rich full tail. This also uses a little bit more CPU if you set it to high because there is more reflections. Wet and dry. This is on most effects, so you probably know it, but it controls how much the effect you want versus how much of the original sound you want. Too much wet and your sound will drown in reverb. Keep it balanced. You can also put your reverb on a send bus. Now you can put the reverb on the send bus to 100%. Now you can mix in the reverb, so you have control of the reverb, but you still maintain the clarity of the sound. This way you also don't have like 20 different reverbs on 20 different tracks. But sometimes you maybe want that totally wet sound because you're making a pad or something. That's totally fine, up to you. Now, we get into the more technical stuff that most people don't know, and they just pick a preset and mix it in. But it's pretty easy, don't you worry. Early reflections and diffusion. Okay, there are three parts of a sound when you add reverb to it. The source, the early reflections, and the diffusion. The early reflections are the first group of echoes that occur when sound hits the room. These reflections tend to sound more like an echo, more defined than a reverb. You can turn them up or down using this knob. You can also modulate these early reflections if you want to, using this section. Then there's diffusion. Diffusion is for the most part the actual reverb sound of the effect. The higher you turn it up, the denser it will be. Turning it up will give it more of a natural sound, while turning it down will give it more of an airy quality because it's thinner. This is density, that is scale. Scale controls the coarseness of the diffusion, but I think it's pretty subtle. You don't have the ability to EQ before the sound enters the reverb, and now you have the ability to EQ afterwards. But if you're looking for more advanced features, let's level up. Alright, let's start with convolution reverb, because this is where things get real, literally. Convolution reverbs uses these impulse responses to simulate real places on Earth. You can think of impulse responses like you're taking a sonic photograph of a room. You're then afterwards applying that photo to your sound. Impulse responses can be from halls and corridors and rooms and even like caverns. When you load the impulse response onto the convolution reverb, it tries to make the sound behave as if it was in that room. Let's look at the controls on the convolution reverb. This first one is the impulse response selection. This is where you choose the impulse response you want the sound to be in. Ableton comes with a lot of different places that you can choose, but you can also load your own. You can do some really cool stuff like using a sound of a synthesizer as your impulse response. Then there are the same parameters we already talked about, so I won't talk about them. But Ableton's Convolution adds 3 new different parameters that are really cool. First off, position. Position essentially just puts your reverb in a selected spot in your stereo field. Dampening. People get dampening and EQ confused, but they're not the same. Dampening, unlike EQ, doesn't cut out frequencies. Instead, you control how much decay you want on those frequencies in the reverb. Like with this example, you still have the low end of the sound, but the decay is just very small. You can use it to control the muddiness of a sound without removing the natural warmth. And now shape. Shape does a lot of things, but it's pretty straightforward. Fade in and out controls if you want a fade in and out on the actual reverb sound itself. Early controls the early reflections like we talked about earlier. Length is cool. You can trim your actual reverb down so you can make this choppy rhythmic thing with your reverb. And you can reverse your reverb if you want to do some crazy stuff. Convolution reverb is really cool for if you want to create a realistic reverb or create your own spaces. If you have a room at home that's really cool, then you can pop a balloon in there, record the sound, put an impulse response into the convolution reverb and use that. That was a lot of words, but it's cool. But it's also a sound designer's wet dream because you can just be more creative. Next up, we have the hybrid reverb. It's a new one and it's really cool. Think of it as like combining the best of those two worlds. Convolution reverb, as we talked about earlier, is based on real-world spaces. Algorithmic reverb, on the other hand, tries to generate artificial spaces using mathematical models. Ableton's classic reverb is an algorithmic reverb, and we have the convolution reverb. The hybrid reverb tries to combine those two together. There is a lot of stuff happening on this reverb, but it's for the most part just things we already talked about. The general idea of this reverb is we have 2 reverbs at the same time. We have the algorithmic and we have the convolution. Then with this button you can control if you want those reverbs to blend together with serial or parallel so they become their own sound. Then you have this blend knob. This is where the magic happens. This is where you blend between the algorithmic reverb and between the convolution reverb. If you want a real-world space, but with a bit of synthetic reverb, you can find the perfect balance here. Here, there's different impulse responses like earlier, and here, there's different algorithms. I would just recommend trying some different algorithms because they're all cool, they all do some crazy stuff, but I can't cover it all. You can do some crazy stuff like this. You can take the shimmer and the big room here and blend them together. There's all kinds of stuff to do. Other than that, you have this vintage button to degrade the sound so it sounds older. And you have this bass button if you want the bass to be in mono so it won't muddy the mix. But when should you use hybrid reverb? I think this is your go-to if you want a balance between realism and creative freedom. If you want your music to sound like it's coming from a real place but with this unique synthetic spin to it, you can use this. It's fantastic for sound design or just creating layered, complex reverbs. Alright, that's it. Now you officially know more about reverb than 99% of your friends probably, and I'm not even making that up. You can go around town confidently and ask people if they know what an impulse response is, and if they say no, just laugh in their face, laugh manically. They deserve it. Anyway, I hope you learned something today, or at least have the confidence now to pretend you know what you're doing. And if you didn't get anything out of it, well, you got to listen to me for a few minutes, and that's great, I guess. So there's that. Hit that like button, smash that subscribe, help me out, watch the video 1,000 times, don't skip anything, it will really help me out. You can also ring that notification bell so you'll be informed next time I put a video up that's equally confusing. Love you guys.